Making sense from sensors and what does it mean for our built environment. I thought we might take a brief look this morning at what this era of big data might mean for us in terms of our built environment. So let's go on a little bit of a journey together and see what might be possible as we go forward. So what I thought I'd do is break the content down like this. We'll begin with a little bit of an historical perspective, taking us from the era of what we might term little data to our current era of big data. Let's take a look at what we mean by making sense of it all, putting the smart into meters. We have smart meters, we have smart this, and we have smart that. But just how smart is that? Can it be smarter? You bet it could. Let's see the kind of things that might be possible. I've focused on a couple of examples. The area of co-heating testing, which I know there's a lot of work here at Leeds, there's work that we've done at Loughborough and in many other places, and also the area of residential thermal comfort. Just pick these two areas, there will be many of course, and then a view of potential future opportunities. So that's the kind of structure to our chat this morning. Well, let's start by going back to what you might term the old days. And if we think about our built environment and our homes and how we heated them, then we only need to go back to the 1950s or before to realise that our homes were very much heated by coal fires. And if you wanted to know how much heating energy you used to heat your home, you basically had to count the number of coal sacks that were delivered to your home. I know all about this from personal experience. I grew up in a small house in South Wales. It had two coal fires, one in the kitchen lit every day, the one in the front room only lit on special occasions if there were visitors coming. So we had to keep these fires fueled by deliveries of coal, and I was always fascinated to wonder why my granny always bought coal from Mr. Phillips on a Monday. He had a green lorry. Why didn't you buy it from Mr. Bailey on a Friday? He had a red lorry, and that was a much more exciting colour to me. But there we go. So basically, energy consumption measured by number of coal sacks. But don't forget, we did have electricity. And of course you then had the challenge of reading a rather tricky analog electric meter where you were faced with all these dials and wondered, oh crumbs, how do I kind of figure this out? But we did, and that's what the world was like not so very long ago. Well, we've gone from that to our current situation. We are now in the era of what's popularly termed big data. We have large volumes of data gathered in many different ways. That data is complex. It requires complex and advanced analysis. It involves a variety of technologies to gather these data, some of which smart meters, various sensors, iPhones, apps, all of this is the world that we live in today. And this is a world that is getting bigger. This is growing. We're entering the era of even bigger data with even bigger potential capability. The capability to control more features of our homes or other buildings. We have technology now that is wearable. We can potentially link this to things that we wear to give us control. It could even gather data about ourselves as human beings that could potentially be integrated with this kind of whole data-rich environment. And of course, not forgetting the Internet of Things, where now we have data capture by objects themselves, devices, and these objects and devices can gather data and they can communicate with one another. So what we're faced with all this is, well, what does it all mean? How do we make sense of all this? Huge amounts of data. The key thing is, what can we do with it that's useful to us and will give us fresh insights? So to try and take a walk in that direction, I thought we'd start off with, let's begin with an analogy that a colleague of mine, Dr. David Allinson, in the Berg group at Loughborough, he loves to make this analogy, and it's a great one, I think. Cars and capabilities. You buy a car for around £20,000, let's say. What that car gives you is the capability to know your miles per gallon. It can give you data on system warnings, what's likely to fail. You can have technology about collision avoidance, driver steering correction. Cars can self-park, and they can even be driverless. So we've kind of gone from your 50s wonderful classic dashboard to the more modern dashboard of today, where you have a complete digital display on your dashboard and virtually an onboard computer that's more powerful than was in the Apollo missions that were sent to the moon. Let's contrast and compare that with our homes. Our homes cost about 200,000, let's say. Yes, you can know much more about your energy usage. You've got some basic smart metering. You've got some app-based control. But I wouldn't say we've exactly gone from the capability of we got in our homes at present to what we have in our cars today. So just an analogy to sort of whet our appetite of what might be possible. So let's take a look at just a couple of areas where more things might well be possible. Let's look at the area of co-heating testing, which I know is an area of which a great deal of work has been done here at Leeds and at Loughborough and various other places. And let's take a closer look at what might be possible here. Firstly, for those who may not be familiar, the principle of co-heating testing is to measure the rate at which you input energy into a building, and from a knowledge of the rate of energy input to maintain a chosen temperature difference between the indoors and the outdoors, then the factor that connects them is what's called the heat loss coefficient, or HLC, which gives you a measure of the heat leakiness of the fabric, often together with the ventilation rate as well. So if, for example, we were to use a home's heating system to deliver that heat, and I know there's been work recently published here and we've done work ourselves on this, that gives you a much more convenient platform to work from. If you have sensors that can regularly monitor that heat delivery, that can regularly monitor the electrical demand of the building, of the home, that can regularly monitor the indoor-outdoor temperature difference, and then you need some information about the solar heat gain, well, there's plenty of data out there on the web now about local weather, irradiances. If you can then link from that and deduce what that means for the solar gain to a home, and then you link all that via what you might call a smarter meter, then just some possibilities, you could get to a situation where you could have continuous tracking of those heat loss coefficients across the stock. If every home had this capability, it's not a great deal more to do, then you could track the heat loss coefficients across the stock. That would allow you to evaluate the benefits of energy efficiency refurbishments. It gives you a quality assurance perspective. It would also allow you to identify poor performing buildings specifically, and that kind of data and information could lead you to designing policies to target your resources to deliver effective interventions. So that's the kind of thing that might be possible. There may well be more. And to develop that kind of capability successfully, clearly there is a need for rigorous analysis of the approach and of the data that's gathered by various sensors. I say various sensors, it's easy to stick sensors all over the place and measure a whole load of things, but it costs you some money, and the question is, what do you measure? Where do you measure it? How often do you measure it? And then what do you do with what you've measured? So there's a kind of an economic aspect here to give you a kind of an economic deployment of these sensing technologies. And you're trying to do this in a kind of a context which is about, well, how much should I do, which is just adequate for purpose, for sufficiency of accuracy. So these are the kind of factors that we have to bear in mind in this kind of approach. And of course, you then need to validate whatever new approach you come up with. But the main message is, whatever it might be, this kind of capability is certainly doable with the sort of technology we have today. We need to basically test and rigorously investigate this and see how useful such approaches can be. Some useful references which are contributing to this kind of agenda. There was work published by Farmer here at Leeds Beckett in 2016. There was work published by one of our PhD students, Richard Jack, and evidence for the reliability of co-heating testing published just recently. And of course, the very important work of the International Energy Agency's Annex 71. So we've got a lot of activity going on that could lead us into that kind of direction. Let's take another potential example. What more can you do with iPhones and for data gathering? A project that we recently concluded, called the GII project, Global Innovation Initiative Project, was looking at thermal comfort in residences in the UK and in India. And it was really interested in the role that air motion might play in achieving comfort conditions without having to resort to air conditioning. So that was a project which linked us with SET University India, and our data was supplied to UC Berkeley's database that's being built on conditions in homes. What we essentially did was deliver a large survey through an iPhone to individuals who agreed to take part. So every week they would be sent a little prod which said, please fill in the questionnaire on your iPhone, which they did. It took them no more than 10 minutes. That was transmitted back to us, and we gathered all that digital data very seamlessly and very, very easily. For the UK part of the study, it took place over 9 months. We had 11 homes, up to 4 occupants in each home, and it generated more than 400 data points. And there was a similar number of apartments in India. And it allowed us to gather quite a lot of information about people's thermal sensations in their home, what they were doing, what their clothing behaviours were. We could even determine where they were at the time they completed our questionnaire, and we were also able to gather information on their ventilation practices. So just as a sort of a small sample of the kind of data we got, for the UK participants, this was a breakdown of their main activities when they completed the questionnaire. So you can see the kind of things people were involved in, quite a large amount of the time seated quietly or seated working, doing housework, etc. Another batch of data related to people's clothing behaviours, what they were wearing at the time, and we could take that down to a granularity. I thought this was quite an interesting one. People's footwear behaviour, the difference between summer and winter. You can see from these pie charts, people wear more socks in winter than in the summertime at home when they might have nothing on their feet. Small piece of data, but just imagine you can gather that kind of information. And this sort of data about activity, clothing level, are key factors involved in the assessment of thermal comfort in environments. We asked people about their thermal sensation, how comfortable they felt, whether they were slightly warm, slightly cool, etc. And this was the data we got back in terms of what they told us across a 9-month period. So these were just some samples of the kind of data we got. But again, the main message here is we got all this from an iPhone and interacting with that iPhone via a suitable survey and gathering that data digitally. Now, where might this kind of stuff take us? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but what about this? If we, for example, use sensors to monitor comfort-relevant variables, and you did that in conjunction with some suitable model, could we maybe get to the stage where we sell comfort instead of energy? When we go home at night, we don't want to go home and say, I fancy a few kilowatt hours of gas tonight. You don't really think like that. You think, bloody hell, I want to go home and I want to be comfortable, and I'm going to turn on the heating system. That's what people want, but what we're actually doing is we're selling energy to achieve a temperature which hopefully will make us feel comfortable. So maybe selling comfort gives us a different paradigm which might bring us some new possibilities for addressing all kinds of problems. I don't know. Maybe the issue of fuel poverty. What if we were to guarantee people a minimum level of comfort, irrespective of whatever? Might that give us a new perspective to achieve equality in terms of good environments for everyone? What about the threat of mass air conditioning as the climate warms up? One of the scariest things about our work in the project with India and the US was the Indian economy is soaring forward, and sales of air conditioners are absolutely rocketing. And what that means is if you have the disposable income to buy these things and fit them in your home, just imagine the amount of carbon emission that's going to occur from that. And if we can give people the confidence that you can be comfortable by less energy intensive means, so much the better. Maybe these kind of approaches can help in that direction. I was very struck by a comment that one of my colleagues, Rajan Rowell at SEPT University, made the other week. And he said, the iPhone will do for measurement what the laptop did for modelling. I thought that was a very incisive comment. Well, what about, as a final example, what about the Internet of Things? We're all familiar with what this sort of means. What possibilities might there be? Once again, your guesses are as good as mine, but one of the most obvious ones might be, well, we could determine who uses what in terms of energy consuming devices and for how long they use them. We could then deduce, well, what's your personal energy bill, or what's your personal carbon footprint, etc., etc. You can think of no doubt many other things as well. In a project that we completed several years ago, the Calibre project, we used some of this technology. This was a 6-university partnership, including the University of Nottingham, and our colleagues at Nottingham, they used an occupant sensing and tracking device which allowed them to know where people were in their test home, to know what devices they were using, and to produce maps like this of where people congregated most of their time in the home. And one of the really interesting things that arose from this is this might have been the occupancy location map for the house without insulation and with single glazing. Once that house had been insulated and, say, double glazed, you then started to see more usage of the space at these peripheries, which now were more comfortable and allowed you to use greater space in the house. But the interesting thing is, we have a quantified metric that allows you to make a judgment on that. So who knows where all this can take us? Pulling it together, broad summary messages then. We're in the era of big data. That data needs to be quality assured. It needs to be rigorously analysed. Those outcomes need to be validated, and that can lead us to potential new insights. Those insights can be made possible and exploitable via the technological means we have. It's important to keep things balanced between the scale of the data gathering and the cost and accuracy which is sufficient for purpose. Smart meters can and will become smarter, but it's very important that that additional information adds value for people. It's all very well telling householders, did you know that your heat loss coefficient was such and such? Well, yeah, great, big deal. What do I do with it? Well, we need to interpret that carefully to send the right messages to aid people's behaviour change. But big data is bringing us big opportunities. Earlier this month there was a report published by the Department for Transport, and that was looking at big data and Internet of Things for the transport sector. There will be similar opportunities for the built environment, and there is a lot of interest now growing in that. There was a message this week from BISRIA who are taking this on board and are keeping a watching brief on it. So I guess my main message today is, what do all these possibilities mean for you and your area of work? What can all this massive new paradigm of data do in the context that you work? Thanks very much for listening.